The first officially released picture record of our part in the World War, compiled by military experts. Considering that these pictures were taken under fire with fatalities to cameramen, the results are remarkable. In 1915, Germany declared a blockade of the British Isles and warned that it would attack any enemy ship that tried to get through. The following shots were taken from a German U-boat that attacked Allied ships. From 1914 to 1917, there were 7 great naval events. The Battle of Coronel, the Dardanelles Operation, the Battle of the Atlantic, among others. It was during this time that the modern submarine proved its value as a warship. The German UB-2 was a prime example of this devastating weapon. Remaining neutral during the early years, Americans only became angry at the Central Powers after the Germans began sinking unarmed ships. In 1917, the U.S. joined the Allies against the Central Powers. We desire no conquest. We seek no indemnities. The Allies fought bravely on, but the Western Front hardly moved for 3.5 years. Medium and heavy guns played a major role in World War I. The first tactical surprise of the war was Big Bertha, the largest gun yet to be used by a field army. No man's land, the place you didn't want to be. Always exposed, never knowing what was under your feet. The flamethrower was first used by the Germans. The technology was at an early stage and had low destructive power. Liquid fire was used extensively by the Germans as a tactical weapon at Verdun. The British Empire suffered almost 1 million deaths and over 2 million injuries during the war. The British mobilized 9.5 million men since entering the conflict in August 1914. The courageous French fought back the invaders with the heroic battle cry, "They shall not pass." France entered the war one day before Great Britain and mobilized 8.5 million men. However, French soldiers suffered a 60% casualty rate. The Italians fought desperately in their mountain fastnesses. The Italian army was led by General Luigi Cardona, and they hammered away at Austria-Hungary for 2 full years, suffering heavy casualties. The United States entered this Great War unprepared. Strong anti-war feelings had prevented efforts to prepare for war. After war was declared, the government had to stir up enthusiasm for the war effort. Finally in gear, the War Industries Board began building new camps and war materials. Everything was needed: guns, ships, men, and all the supplies necessary to keep them going in war. The Allies had given high priority to field artillery, of which the French-designed 75 was most notable. But in trench conditions, the howitzer, firing high explosive shells, came into its own. Hog Island Shipyard. The shipyards could not turn out warships fast enough. As soon as one would slide down the ways, the next new keel was laid. After all, the United States had to transport over 4 million men and supplies quickly. Hundreds of thousands volunteered. Nearly 3 million were drafted. Secretary of War Newton D. Baker draws the first number. Number 1. Theodore Roosevelt wishes he was one of them. By the trainloads, they left for training camp. All in all, 4 million men went off to war. In fact, supplies could not keep up with the amount of incoming men. But they survived. They even survived the crack medical staffs. Heroes in the making. Like all young men, the realizations of war had not yet come upon them. Give them a few months with their drill instructor and Top conditioning is a requirement for men going off to war. Obstacle course training will prepare the men for the life in the trenches yet to come. Our sea dogs growl. On their way to join the British fleet. The convoys of U.S. naval power helped Great Britain maintain its superiority over the Germans. King George welcoming the American fleet. The King made several morale-building trips to the Grand Fleet. The war caused the King to adopt a new surname, Windsor. The previous name, Saxe-Coburg, was of Germanic descent and inappropriate during war. At Lafayette's tomb. Arriving in France in 1917, General John Blackjack Pershing came directly from his pursuit of Pancho Villa to head the expeditionary forces. Mustard gas was a tactical weapon of the Central Powers, so training with masks was a must. In October 1917, a few of our troops became acquainted with the enemy in quiet sectors. Mud, water, disease, and lack of the most basic amenities was the norm during this war. Who knows when he will be able to write home again? Big business. Come on, 7. And monkey business. Doughboys need to take advantage of every opportunity. On March 21, 1918, the enemy launched against the British the first of a series of attacks to crush the Allies before the arrival of the Americans in force. The French brought up men and guns to stop the enemy's rapid advance. This offensive was the first of Germany's last 3 offensives on the Western Front. On April 9th, an enemy offensive in Flanders forced the British to rush up reserves. This offensive along the Lys River in Belgium caused heavy Allied losses, but the German losses were nearly as great. The British met attack with counterattack over shell-torn ground. The effects of the big guns was devastating on troops of both sides. The new mobility of these weapons, by rail, tank, and truck mounted, gave both sides the ability to move quickly to where they're needed most. With enormous losses, the Allies were fighting with their backs to the wall. The typical front-line trench was 6 to 8 feet deep and wide enough for 2 men to pass. The Allies appealed to America for more men. It was obvious from the beginning that the initial estimate of 1 million Americans was far short of the need. Troops by the thousands were ready to ship out. One of the major concerns during Atlantic crossings was German submarines, so the Navy was always on the lookout. The troops prepare in case of sub-attack. Life jackets on and lifeboats at the ready. Every method to protect themselves was used, from surface guns to the new Y guns. This new weapon throws the depth charges to each side of the ship, which explode beneath the surface, disabling the U-boats without harming the surface ships. This smokescreen enabled ships to hide and change position out of sight of submarines. Finally, en masse, the troops begin arriving. After a week at sea, these doughboys are ready for solid ground. Here is one extra passenger who seemed to make it all right. Men, men, men. Over 4 million men arrived during the year to support the American Expeditionary Force and the Allies they have come to help. As soon as they land, they are shipped out by train, truck, even horseback. At Cantigny and Chateau Thierry, the enemy first realized that the Yanks were there. Hurling himself at the French, the enemy quickly pushed 35 miles to the Marne. Paris, his next goal. This marked the beginning of the second to last offensive of the war. It marked the turning point in the war for the Allies. In the crisis, Americans were rushed to halt the advance. Without hesitation, the troops were ordered to the Marne region and Chateau Thierry. It was too late for Chateau Thierry. The Central Powers troops had completely destroyed the village. The Americans counterattacked with the Marine Brigade and the 3rd Infantry Brigade leading the 6 successive assaults. After 3 weeks of heavy fighting, Belleau Wood was cleared and Vaux was retaken. Americans lost over 1,800 men and suffered 7,000 casualties. Troops kept arriving throughout the war, over 10,000 men a day by ship. The rapidly increasing American forces played an important part in stopping the last great enemy offensive. With Americans in the place of honor, the Allies assumed the offensive and drove the enemy from the Marne salient. On July 18th, our troops attacked before dawn, driving a deep wedge into the enemy line south of Soissons. By early September, the enemy had lost all the ground it gained since the spring. Unseasoned troops put themselves at risk by walking upright and making targets of themselves instead of remembering their basic training. The first usage of telegraphic communications in war occurred during this Great War. Wires were strung from the command posts to the field observers everywhere. The time between battles was getting shorter, so men had to take advantage wherever they could. They had to dress their wounds, rest, and care for the prisoners they captured. To cross the Marne, portable bridges were built. The American Expeditionary Force is like any other army. It moves on its stomach. Field kitchens like this had to feed 4 million mouths under terrible conditions. For the first time in weeks, the troops get to rest, wash their clothes, get haircuts, and generally do some recuperation from the hard-fought battles. Every day, ships arrived, depositing thousands of U.S. troops on Allied soil. And while men kept coming, so did the supplies necessary to keep such an army moving and fed. "1,500 miles of railway were built to move these supplies to the front lines. Not only did the forces have to fight their way to victory, but they had to build a complete infrastructure simultaneously. Hundreds of warehouses had to be built to hold all the supplies arriving daily. At any one time, the cooks were baking bread for up to 2 million doughboys. As commander-in-chief of the Expeditionary Force, General Pershing gave the orders. The American Army took over the Saint-Mihiel sector on August 30, 1918, to ready its offensive against the Germans. Troops from all over were convoyed in with the purpose of reducing the salient, which reached to the River Meuse, southeast of Verdun. On September 8, General Ludendorff of the German command began evacuating his troops. He was well aware of the danger the Americans presented. On September 12, the American assault began. The First Army, 16 divisions, struck in dense fog on both sides of the salient, with the main assault coming from the south face. By the end of the day, the converging attack forces met at Hauts-de-Châtel. French tanks and artillery provided needed support as the Americans were opposed by 9 divisions of German forces. In preparation for the arrival of American forces, the Germans had strung razor-sharp barbed wire across the routes the Americans would have to take. Troopers had to cut away this wire before our troops could move forward. Once ready, the command was given and the assault forces began the attack. Infantrymen, tanks, rolling artillery all began moving forward. Additional cover for the infantry came from an Allied force of over 600 planes under the command of Colonel William Billy Mitchell. America's highest scoring ace was Captain Eddie Rickenbacker with 26 confirmed victories. He first went to France as General Pershing's driver. These early aircraft were cloth and wood, but they were able to stand up to the stresses of in-close dogfighting. Here, a captured enemy pilot is seen contemplating his future. Caissons, or ammunition wagons, were the way the troops and artillery got their new supplies. Each hit by the artillery forced the enemy to move backwards and away from the salient. The trench system usually consisted of 3 trenches: front, support, and reserve, all in close proximity to each other. Troops had poor accommodations and often spent up to 8 days in the trenches. Anywhere a dry spot could be found became an aid station. This soldier knows he's on the way to the hospital and out of the fighting. The Battle of Saint-Mihiel was highly successful, but Pershing suffered 7,000 casualties in what became the largest American battle since the Civil War. The Americans took 16,000 German prisoners and captured 250 artillery weapons. The machine gun made this war deadlier than any other. The gun's rapid fire slaughtered attacking infantrymen and slowed advancing forces to a crawl. Comedians everywhere. The Germans used dogs to transfer messages. They placed them in the containers on the collar. Armies move on their stomachs, but potatoes get peeled while sitting on bottoms. For the first time in 4 years, a free French people get to read a French newspaper. The American offensive could have continued, but General Pershing promised to immediately move his troops to the Argonne Forest for the next major offensive. Over the years of the war, the Allies mobilized over 40 million men to combat the aggressiveness of the Central Powers. A major objective of the combined Australian-American forces was to retake the St. Quentin Canal Tunnel, which ran underground and behind the famed Hindenburg Line. By nightfall of September 29, the combined forces reached and won their objective. The Belgian king and queen review the troops in gratitude. The last great offensive of the World War was to begin on September 26. 900,000 U.S. troops participated in fighting between the Argonne Forest and the River Meuse. As the troops marched forward, the Germans began to realize they could no longer overcome the superior strength of the Allies. The weather was freezing, with rain and sleet during the buildup not helping morale at all. An assault of the size planned required troops from all armies to be combined and assigned specific objectives before the battle could begin. At 5:30 a.m., in a cold, damp mist and light rain, the offensive began. Waves of men started the assault. It seemed like they would never stop coming. To give the artillery and infantry correct information about enemy positions, the Army would send observers up in sausage-shaped balloons connected by early communications devices and tethers. These observers were at great risk from enemy aircraft. Here, an observer's balloon is shot at by the enemy. Obviously, not waiting to see the end result, this observer leaps into open space and the safety of his parachute. Meanwhile, Allied forces send up anti-aircraft fire, hoping to drive off the attacker. Here, the shrapnel from anti-aircraft guns explode near the plane, but not in enough time to save the balloon. Troops in the trenches wait their turn to charge the enemy. To see above the trenches and to spot the enemy, periscopes like this were devised. The advent of big searchlights and heavy artillery fire made night almost as bright as day, giving no rest to the weary soldiers. The enemy artillery was able to make devastatingly accurate hits on the Allied forces by laying down an inferno of fire. But the will of the enemy was waning, and they kept being pushed back rapidly from the ground they were holding. Troops were able to move forward easily once the enemy started to run. In a desperate attempt to slow the Allies down, the Germans targeted every point where the Allies could pass with their artillery and machine guns. The Allies, though, used their 37-millimeter guns to destroy the machine gun emplacements and open the way for the troops. In the forest areas, though, our troops had to take out the machine gunners personally. These infantrymen are ready to take out a machine gun nest. Grenades came into their own in this conflict, making it far easier to remove unwanted obstructions. Montfaucon was a highly contested area because it was over 1,000 feet above sea level, providing an all-around observation point of the 3 roads leading into the area. All in all, Germany alone mounted over 12 million troops during the war, suffering almost 2 million dead and millions more casualties. These German soldiers were among the luckier ones. The battle was prosecuted with an aggressive and heroic spirit of courage and fortitude, which demanded eventual success despite all obstacles. Even the enemy has a best friend. Enemy prisoners of war. Another German aircraft is shot down by the Allies. After so many days on the front lines fighting, these men came to the rear for rest. General Pershing was so proud of his men that he personally placed their decorations on them. Here, the commander-in-chief takes out time to talk with a doughboy. A local milk dispenser being squeezed. KFC welfare. One way to boost morale is bringing entertainment to the troops, some of it unexpected. While some troops were resting from the fighting, others were still having to make advances on the enemy. As always, supply convoys had to catch up to the troops. To rebuild the roads for the supply convoys, sometimes the remains of buildings had to be torn down and used as roadbeds. Then the rubble had to be spread, and roads were built on it. Road obstructions had to be cleared for the artillery and supply lines to keep moving. Fresh troops were brought up the roads to relieve the worn-out infantry units. constant harassment of the enemy by our forces had a demoralizing effect on their ability to fight back. The German forces had been moving reinforcements up all the while, especially in the lulls in the action. The enemy began this phase of the last great battle of the war with renewed vigor, manpower, and supplies. Our troops had to dig in for the long haul. Throughout October, our troops, under constant shell and machine gun fire, fought the enemy's best divisions. During this period, the allies of Germany began to fall. The Bulgarians surrendered on September 29, and General Edward Allenby and his troops were victorious over the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, Pershing's troops were moving across the River Meuse to their next objective. In the last days of the engagement, the enemy laid down a barrage of fire, trying to cover the retreat of their troops. The action in this scene shows the expanse of the area and artillery from both sides engaged in battle against each other. Finally, after 3 long, hard weeks, the enemy broke and ran. They knew this was their last hurrah, and they could no longer hold the territories they had taken. But even as they ran, their artillery pounded the towns and villages to give them cover and to still try to slow down the American and other Allied forces. American forces, victorious, marched to their objectives, proud of their accomplishments and contributions to the war effort. These French citizens never gave up their towns and villages, preferring to stay with their homes. Victory for the Americans was complete when they reached their objective, the Southern Railroad line. The Allied victory was complete when on November 11, the order came to cease fire.